I've been poring over this stuff for a while, and when Al Gore won the Peace Prize for it, I'd had enough. The global warming issue is complicated not because of the science behind it, but because of the politics behind it. In a departure from my traditional method aimed at a better understanding on an alternative viewpoint of those politics, I'll be looking at the science. I had intended a while back to do a video about ethanol 85, and I'd mentioned that before because it's scientifically known to be impractical. It is being employed because it puts money in a lot of pockets. E85 produces 25% less carbon emission than standard gasoline, which sounds good on paper until you realize it's anywhere from 20 to 35% less efficient during combustion, meaning that when you use it as a fuel, you will have to use it more of it than you would gasoline. This inefficiency pronounces itself further when you learn that it takes, for every gallon produced, the equivalent amount of fossil fuel to simply produce it. This is true because the processing plants rely on the power grid, which is predominantly fossil fuel burning. Also, it takes 10 tons of water to process 1 ton of E85. Now, the politicians love this stuff because it's alternative, which is a great buzzword. The main consumers of fossil fuels in the world are power plants anyway, not cars, but that's not what this is about. I mention E85 because of the carbon emission problem, which is at the tip of everyone's tongue in the global warming debate, but not on the tip of mine. Let's talk about water vapor. Water vapor is the #1 contributing terrestrial factor to global warming, not carbon. At this point, it is imperative to separate the terms global warming and climate change. We are now talking about climate change. Water vapor is considered an aerosol, a particulate. It entraps and insulates heat, causing a warming effect. But that little point depends on the situation. It can just as easily cause cooling because in concentration increases the planet's albedo or reflective property, so less sun reaches the surface. In the 1970s, the world was afire with talk about global cooling. Just type global cooling in a search engine to see this. This is absolutely true. Earth scientists were convinced we were on the verge of another little ice age like the one we had back in the 1600s. And the reason they thought this was because global average temperatures beginning in the 1940s were lowering, enough so that people became alarmed. Now keep in mind that in the 1940s, that was well after the Industrial Revolution. Scientists of the day became convinced that aerosols were to blame, and many initiatives were taken to solve the problem. They weren't too far from the truth. But that's where it gets hazy, and that pun is intended. Human interaction does not directly affect water vapor concentrations except on a microclimate scale, and it has a very short life cycle. The turnaround of about 10 days, for the most part, is what applies to water vapor, where it is estimated that in order for the Earth to eliminate an imbalance of carbon may take 10,000 years or more. At this moment, let me say that 450 million years ago, carbon levels were 20 times higher than they are today, and temperatures were actually much lower, which leads me, as it should most, to believe that because scientists are taking the easy road to explain global warming by saying that CO2, being a minor greenhouse gas, triggers a larger water vapor response to counteract it, while at the same time excluding cloud formation because it's too complex to explain or even understand completely, and ignoring detailed temperature measurements spanning some 500 million years, that we should question their motives and their credentials. All of this so far is very pseudo-scientific, and it'll pretty much remain that way, even though it's all based on real facts and real research. Otherwise, I'd be sitting here typing another War and Peace, and I'm unwilling to do that for a YouTube video. I mentioned terrestrial contributors to global warming earlier. The #1 contributing factor to global warming, above, beyond, and by far more important than human interaction and even earthly processes, is solar input. Solar input, although largely ignored in this so-called debate, has been scientifically shown in paleoclimatology models and samples to have varied right along with global average temperatures without exception. 125, 250, 350, and 400,000 years ago are all red-letter dates for global warming, all of which had a peak in temperature and relative deglaciation above and more so than today, respectively. All of these points had an accompanying low point, which at times reached some 6 degrees Celsius below average temperatures as we know them. and all of them were accompanied by periods of increased or decreased solar activity. And I assure you, increased solar activity is not a consequence of human interaction, nor were these periods of warming and cooling. Although humans were around, their little campfires did not massively shape the world in which we live, and neither do ours. The charts Gore used for those that many global warming supporters also show our carbon emission levels rising over the past 40 years, as well as global averages of temperature. But when you look at a fair chart mapping anything more than 40 years, wild swings in global temperatures and varying carbon levels appear, stretch even further, and you'll start to see a pattern. And carbon has never been attributed as a cause for any of it, of any major consequence. Solar input has been, I'd say, something on the order of 75% the cause, whereas water vapor comes in a pretty close second. When these so-called climatologists can help meteorologists predict weather, I'll start considering their opinions when they're on the side of the global warming alarmists. I'd like to, for a moment, talk about an inconvenient truth. A few alarmist ideas in it warrant a calm explanation. It is asserted that sea levels will rise by as much as 20 feet in the immediate future. This is absurd, as even the scientific community he aligns himself with laughs at this one. It would take average temperatures several degrees higher than they are today, more than 1,000 years, to melt a glacier the size of Greenland, period. And in further science lifted from the ridiculous movie Day After Tomorrow, he states that the Gulf Stream could shut down because of mixing fresh water from melting glaciers and seawater in the immediate future. It is agreed among many scientists that even with a projected 4 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperatures by the year 2100, that the likelihood of the collapse of this current is no more significant than 0%. Even those that feel it is likely also state that it is unlikely that it would ever completely stop within the next several thousand years, and then it may only slow down. And as I said before, to melt enough glacier to cause such a significant change in the ocean would take 500 years or more, but on the standard models indexing climate change over the last 500,000 years, it appears that what is happening now is completely normal, and the current solar cycle, as well as the previously mentioned historical record, should lead many to agree that we are on the cusp of a cooling period. And those drowning polar bears, 4 in all, died as a result of a storm. That was actually documented. All of this is said to be a consequence of increased carbon emissions. Carbon levels, as I said before, have been many times higher than they are now, and even at the current trend would take several hundred years to restore them to a level last seen 450 million years ago when temperatures were lower. Gore had shown another chart mapping global temperatures over 650,000 years with the accompanying carbon levels, and asserts that this is the most important relationship in the greenhouse effect. Now, look up the greenhouse effect anywhere to see that this is in fact a flat-out lie. He tries ridiculing scientists who disagree with his assertion. Although there is a relationship between carbon levels and global average temperatures, the effect water vapor has is the dominating force in maintaining and changing worldwide temperatures on a terrestrial level. The end. And this cannot be disputed unless you are Al Gore and simply want a reason to make a half-assed documentary about something he isn't even qualified to comment on. Of course, half of the documentary was about him and his bitterness about losing the election, and I think he simply wants to be on the good side of the ongoing epic battle against the evil oil industry. But if the good side relies on taking advantage of a gullible public by lying to them and turning them away from more socially pressing issues, then all hail fossil fuels. Which brings me to yet another point. Of all the silly things Mr. Gore and the global warming crowd say, they depend on one thing as being universally true, that somehow people will continue using fossil fuels indefinitely and possibly forever. Now, it is clear that moving towards cleaner and more efficient methods of energy generation is not only smart, but imminent. Not to mention, it's estimated that due to the limited supply of this non-renewable resource, it is likely that reserves will simply run out within 200 years or so. So if we haven't switched over to something else by then, it's our fault for being stupid. And check this out. Hydrogeological models suggest that if we really are at fault for the sharp rise in carbon levels, then higher temperatures would cause more evaporation from the oceans, therefore more cloud cover and albedo, which equals cooling on an epic scale. But throwing in a laugh out loud here, I'd like to add that the projected consequence of all this carbon we're putting out there is nothing compared to some of the heat waves and ice ages of the past. There have been at times in the Earth's recent history where it was more than 50% ice and sometimes completely ice-free. It seems that Mr. Gore and the alarmists are simply being extreme conservatives and want the Earth to stay exactly as it is and stay that way forever, which goes against nature. It's always been a belief of mine that natural selection and the evolution of the environment will pretty much solve any problem, and increased carbon levels are no exception. To think that humans can do such damage on a global scale as to somehow outsmart or outwit Mother Earth is just silly, and only highlights our arrogance. Whether she maintains it as a comfortable environment for us humans or not is the real question, and if all the global warming chatter is true, then she probably won't, and I wouldn't blame her. But every scenario based on real science says she will, and some basic and instinctual adaptation for short-term changes is all we will need. And again, we are talking a scale of thousands, not tens of years. Our time here so far amounts to a small dot on a geological time scale, and at our current rate of self-destruction, the dot isn't even likely to smudge. Now, I myself am an advocate of emission controls and elimination of our dependence on fossil fuels, but I do not like it when people are lied to and sold nonsense. Awarding a peace prize to someone who has effectively started a war on real science is a farce. And it only goes on to further prove the Nobel Society is clueless, considering the Mahatma Gandhi isn't even a laureate. To add insult to injury, Gore will not even use his stature as a politician to make change happen, somehow feeling that the presidential office is below him. No single person on Earth right now could cause a greater change in world policy in regards to fossil fuels than the President of the United States of America. That tells me he is insecure in these beliefs and simply wants to make documentaries and money. I wouldn't be surprised to learn major kickbacks are being given to Gore by various agricultural associations, and I don't mean because he's trying to save the planet. These farmers' associations have a vested interest in you switching from gas to E85, as it is made out of corn. And as I said before, vehicle emissions are not the main contributor to carbon emissions. It is the power plants that light your home. Please, as always, look this stuff up. The answers are clear and rather astonishing, and they are like nothing you are hearing from the mainstream, which is kind of the point. Remember, it's the mainstream who work for these corporations and own the corporations and own the media that are telling you all these things. An apathetic public will be responsible for all of hell breaking loose in the future. Not any secret society or a gas-guzzling SUV. In fact, eating a healthy diet of beef for a year contributes to more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than driving a Hummer for the same time period, and that's just the methane emissions. You don't need to factor in power consumed by processing plants that actually slaughter the cows. What sucks is that when someone has a reasonable thing to say about these issues, they are skeptics, as if it's simply known that it's true. You may as well say we live in compounds and show us in slow motion when we're on TV. But I am not a skeptic nor a denier. I understand fully that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and we are producing it. You and I can do the world and society at large a favor by first of all helping to solve the very real problem of the lack of fresh water in urbanized areas. For this also impacts the microclimates around cities and our ability to survive. We need fresh water, and all around the world, reservoirs, lakes, and rivers are drying up because of human interactions such as ambitious irrigation projects and poorly planned development, not global warming. First of all, conserve and hold developers to higher standards in planning urban areas. Then start saying no to industry that uses inordinate amounts of fresh water in manufacturing processes, and then demand that they find alternatives. More efficient desalination is a good first step. These type of microclimate issues tend to spread outward and affect areas that surround it. And please, for the love of Mother Earth, say no to ethanol 85. It makes the oil industry, farmers' coalitions, and crooked politicians like Gore happy. Remember that Gore was a major stockholder in the Occidental Corporation, an oil company. In 1995, he used his political stature as vice president to advocate the sale of the Elk Hills native Indian lands in California for drilling. His ties to the oil industry are much larger than that, too. All of this is about maximizing profit, and they are sucking witless environmentalists into it. Don't be one of them. Adding yet another laugh out loud to this story, ethanol engines cannot contain the lighter, more environmentally friendly material aluminum in them, which means engines which run out of it are heavier, making ethanol more inefficient in yet another ironic way. Think manufacturing is moving forward? Wait till you buy an E85 vehicle with an old cast iron engine in it. Diesel-electric hybrids are the solution in the immediate future, but because of morons like Gore, you may not buy one because you believe diesels are somehow evil. Turn off lights that you aren't using, take a shorter shower, and only water your lawn if you have a garden that you intend to consume. And always carry a brick with you, so if you see a car that has an E85 sticker on it, bust the back window out of it, and don't bother leaving a note.